Hello. I was watching an American YouTube channel hosted by a chap who appears to know quite a bit about military matters. I don't know what his credentials are, but then a lot of people with credentials seem even more clueless than people without credentials a lot of the time, so I'm not sure how much difference that actually makes. Right, so this YouTube analyst pointed out that so far as the progress of the war is going, we're getting only the Ukrainian side of the story. Now, he's quite right. We hear about Russian military losses and not Ukrainian military losses. And in that, as I say, he's quite correct. The narrative is the narrative we're being given mostly is the poor, suffering, but amazingly brave Ukrainians and the horrible invaders. Don't get me wrong, I'm on the side of the Ukrainians. The Russians were the ones who invaded. That, so far as I'm concerned, is the absolute basis of the problem. The Russians invaded. Whatever the reason they give or gave, whatever they thought Ukraine was going to do, it actually had up to then done nothing and was showing no signs of aggression or preparation for aggression. And Russia just zapped it. I want to point something out to you. Many of the Russian tanks were flying Soviet flags. Has anyone noticed that? There are several pictures of Russian tanks flying Soviet flag. You know, that red thing with the hammer and sickle on it. So a lot of people have wondered why they were doing that. And I have the answer, I'm sure. Of course, like with everything else, it's mostly guesswork based on what you know about the people. So you can be wrong about that. But my supposition is that it was a sort of memento mori. In the 1930s, a time that some Ukrainians still actually remember. There are still people around who remember the 30s firsthand. And certainly most Ukrainians will have had stories about the 30s from parents and grandparents, so first-hand accounts. The Soviet flag was flying over the tanks and trucks of the Russian troops that came to confiscate every scrap of food in their houses. I'm serious, they went through everything. They even pulled up floorboards looking for hidden grain and they took everything out of barns and silos and shipped it back to Moscow. And they shot people who resisted. They even shot the stories of women who went out into the fields to pick up little bits of grain that had fallen from the harvesting, from the reaping. And they were shooting those women as well. And they were just trying to feed their children. And that left 5 million of them to starve to death. 5 million Ukrainians, and it's not something you forget in a generation. And they died as a direct result of Soviet policy intent upon wiping them out so that Russians could be settled there to replace them. And it was all done under that red Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle. Look, people have blamed the Ukrainians, and I don't feel so good about that either. So many Ukrainians embraced the German army when they turned up for their invasion. And the Russians called it the Great Patriotic War. But the Ukrainians were just happy to see the Germans because thus far the Germans had not killed 5 million of them. Anyway, as I said, that Soviet flag was being flown on those tanks recently to remind the Ukrainians that the Russians had done it once before and they had no embarrassment about doing it again. And they were reminding them of that. Now, back to the view we have of the two sides. I've no doubt that the optics play a very large part in our perception of what's happening. Here we have the semi-shaven and t-shirted Zelensky pitched visually against the suited Russian mastermind in his magnificent palace. And the funny thing is that I wish I could remember his name. There was an actor in the 1960s and 70s. He turned up in The Saint and The Avengers. He was all over the place, just a character actor. And I don't remember. I did try looking up his name, but I can't find him. Somebody, please, you might remember him. Anyway, he looked just like Putin. So if you saw any of those old episodes on YouTube, or replays of The Saint, that sort of thing, he always played KGB agents, and Putin looked just like that, which it doesn't, in my mind, doesn't do much for my impression of him. Look, despite the images we have, we've also got to remember that the Ukrainians are losing. I can't see. Frankly, I can't see them winning this battle. Russia can just keep on throwing stuff at them unless something really serious happens with the Russian army. And we're definitely not getting both sides of the story, and that's partly because we're getting a lot from the Ukrainians, but frankly, we're not getting much from the Russians. The thing about the Russians is they feel they can only tell you when they've won something, and they don't tell you when they've lost anything, so you've got no perspective to measure progress. However, we do know one thing: they've lost two-star generals in the past 2 weeks, which when I heard that, it reminded me of a famous quotation from Oscar Wilde's play The Importance of Being Earnest. And there's a character in there called Lady Bracknell, and I am going to not quite quote her. She doesn't quite remark at one point that to lose one general might be considered a misfortune, but to lose two sounds like carelessness. It very much does look like carelessness, doesn't it? I'd say losing two generals is a real sign of sloppy organisation. You don't lose generals in a battle. You don't. A friend was chuckling a couple of days ago about Zelensky. She said, at the beginning, he was out there in his combat fatigues, but now he's stuck away safely underground in some bunker or other somewhere. And I pointed out that if he goes out and a sniper gets him, that would be the end. It would be the end of the Ukrainian resistance anyway. Even if he was desperate to get out there with his AK-15 or whatever, his command colleagues would prevent him from doing so because he is Ukraine's voice. They lose him, they lose their voice. This isn't Star Trek, where the captain goes out and does the daring do because he's got a contract to appear in 3 more episodes. But I digress. We don't know exactly how the war is going, and any expert who tells you he does know or she does know, they're lying to you. I don't think anyone has more of an idea than I have. But the irrefutable fact is, sorry, the dog's come up for a cuddle, that the Russians did the invading, and it seems to me that they've lost a fair number of troops. We also hear about Russian desertions and vehicles that can't be repaired because of the long and interrupted lines of communication. I can believe all of that. Also, I can tell you of something I heard from a Polish friend who has friends back in Poland, family back in Poland, and they have friends in Russia. And apparently there are some parts of Russia where people don't even know about the war in Ukraine at all. I don't mean they think it's another great conflict with Nazism, which a lot of Russians are supposed to think. I mean, they don't even know that hostilities have broken out. So that's how big and disorganized Russia is. So here are some figures for what they're worth. Let's have a look. The US military estimates that between 2,000 and 4,000 Ukrainian armed forces, National Guard and volunteer forces have been killed, and between 5,000 and 6,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. And that's an awful lot in 2 weeks of what was supposed to be a cakewalk, isn't it? The Ukrainians say they've done for over 12,000 Russian troops, and there you see a bit of a difference in figures. But they would say that, wouldn't they? However, even the relatively conservative figure of 5,000 Russian dead is quite a number when you think that the Russians lost 15,000 in the 10 years they were in Afghanistan. And by the way, the Americans were supposed to have lost 2,401 soldiers in 20 years in Afghanistan. I know there were probably more. I don't know where they got that 401 from. There must have been more, but still, there is quite a difference in the number of deaths, isn't there? And certainly the Russian figures are quite astounding, considering that they marched in on a mostly unprepared and under-equipped country that was nowhere near as militarized as they were. However, as I said, we can't be sure of any of the recent figures. For a start, in the first week, the whole of Ukraine was under cloud cover, which made satellite surveillance completely impossible. And that was a big problem because a lot of the original Russian casualties probably happened within that first week when they were really not expecting trouble. But still, as I said, we do know they've lost 2 generals in the past 2 weeks, and that's a big thing. Just from that, we can say we know they're in trouble because you don't lose generals. It means that they were exposed in ways they shouldn't have been exposed. And this is something that both NATO and the Chinese will be looking at very closely and studying for years probably. The generals were exposed either because the higher command was incompetent enough to put them in a bad position, or because the generals themselves were too incompetent to understand the dangers. And this is also possible, perhaps their own troops done it. And I haven't heard anyone say that, but it's not outside the bounds of possibility, is it? There's another tactical disaster that the Russians have made, and that was in letting at least one cat out of a very large bag. There might be more, but it is now common enough knowledge that I know about it, and there might be others that more secret areas of the various watching armies might know about. But on this occasion, there's a super secret piece of Russian kit which has now been outed, both from aerial observation and from fragments that have landed. It's a sort of missile called a decoy dart, and so far as I can work out, it piggybacks on the real missile, and then halfway through the flight shoots off and goes in a different direction, emitting streams of random radio signals from one end and enormous quantities of hot air from the other. Well, just like a BBC reporter, actually. And in doing so, drawing off the anti-missile missiles to the wrong target. I would ask Putin, I wish I could ask him, was this war worth the price of the Americans finding out about this secret decoy dart? And maybe other stuff as well, as I said, that they're not giving out to the general public. I've been watching all sorts of news sources, and every single one of them says the Ukrainians are winning, and then the Russians are winning, and well, you pays your money and you takes your choice. We don't know. As I said, all the experts say one thing, I go from one expert to the other, and they say completely opposite things, and that's because it's just not possible in this situation to know. So my guess here is as good as anyone else's, I am, though, fairly confident in making a couple of predictions for you. And the first is that Russia isn't going to do well out of this, whether it wins the war in Ukraine or not. And the second prediction is that Russia isn't going to do well out of this, whoever wins, whether they win or not. Now, I know you might think I was just repeating myself there, but I reckon that observation is so important, I thought that perhaps it should be said twice. And one thing I hope I don't have to say twice is that I'm Graniopteryx. I am to be found on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. When I upload videos, I always message on Twitter, Gab and Parler. So if you subscribe to one of those platforms, you'll always get to know if I've uploaded a new video or not. Well, that's about it. Yes, please share the video, click that like button, and make sure your subscription is still subscribed. And, well, I'll see you next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.